Okay, so the next thing we want to talk about is funding applications, and this is going to be a bit longer, so we're going to break this one down into a couple kind of like sub modules. So as we get into this, we're just going to talk about kind of the entry screen to funding applications, the sections page, allocations, as well as we'll do some ESEA specific stuff around project administration. We'll talk about standard navigation around the system. How districts fill out the budget for both ESEA grants and other grants, the concept of program details, which are just generic data collection pages that can be set up in any number of ways. We'll talk about related documents, validation, submission and review workflow, and then some forms of communication between the district and the ESEA via the history log, comments, and the checklist. So the funding applications main page, this is accessible from the funding node on the left navigation once a district has, once a user has a district in their session. So again, as a state user, you would have to sign in and navigate to a district to see this link. And when we demonstrate, we'll have to sign in and navigate to a district to see the link. But district users themselves will see those links immediately by virtue of being associated with a district. So all of the district's grant applications are going to be here on this funding applications main page. We have fiscal year drop down, so we can go look at prior years, and we can look at active applications as well as approved applications. I think right now, districts really only have one copy of their application, and as they make changes to it, that's still just the one application. We store applications by revision, and once an application is approved, it's basically snapshotted and archived. So if they want to modify, they create a revision to the application, which lives separately from that original version, and each one that's approved we maintain historically separately, so you can see, oh, they did 5 revisions this year, and you can easily see what are the changes they made over those 5 revisions, rather than just kind of having one application where you have to track the things that changed. So right now we'll just have the fiscal year 22 stuff. The fiscal year 2021 allocation and budget data is expected to flow into Grants4ME around July 1. So we'll pull that data out of GEM and bring that into this system. So a couple things we have here, we differentiate entitlement versus competitive applications. I mentioned we keep track of the revisions. We show you what status the application is in. So we see a couple applications here that are not started. And applications are not, so when you load allocation for one of the grants in the application, it creates the application in a status of not started. And then we see what date, what date did it get into that status. So we did some allocation things in late April. For competitive applications, in the instance of like the McKinney-Vento application, they don't have to allocate that for that to show up. The system knows that in a competitive application situation, that it should just show up. And we do have the ability to filter that. Like if it's competitive, but only these 10 districts are gonna submit potentially, we can set it so that only those 10 districts will see the application, and the other districts that aren't going to apply. I know sometimes there's like a letter of intent that they have to submit to say they're going to apply for this. So we have the ability to filter those so that 180 districts don't see an application that they're really not going to be pursuing. So then you would click one of these applications that you want to work in, and that would take you to the sections page. And the sections page is basically how you get into everything that's in the application. And it's a pretty consistent structure across all the applications. We show you at the top the current status the application is in, as well as the statuses that it can be moved into. There's a history log and comments pages. There's an allocations page. Each grant in an application has its own section. And actually, let me say this because I don't think I said it. A funding application is a grouping of grants that follow the same submission and approval workflow and timeline. So a funding application might have 1 grant in it, or it might have 10 grants in it. CT secondary is a funding application with 1 grant in it. The ESEA consolidated has 13-ish grants in it. So it's up to you. It's up to the state to figure out like what grants make sense to group together. So the ESEA application is going to be quite a bit longer than the CT secondary by virtue of it having 13 grants instead of 1. But each grant in a funding application has a section with any number of pages in it. There's general sections that maybe aren't tied to a specific grant, but they're just data that needs to be collected with the application. The sections page shows us validation. This is where a district can see the error and warning messages they have. Errors will prevent the application from being submitted. Warnings are just calling out potential issues. The sections page, you can print from the sections page, print the contents of your application. The sections page will show you a revision details column. When you get to a revision 0 doesn't show that. Revision 0 is the initial application. But when they get into revision status, there's a new column that will show up that allows you to kind of easily see what has changed from the approved application. And then we have a checklist, which is a qualitative review of the application. The systems, we talked about the validation, the system's going to validate that, hey, they didn't budget more than they're allocated and things like that. Things that can be, mathematically or quantifiably checked, the system's going to do most of those. We can check that a district responded to the questions that are required, but we can't really assess the quality of response. So we like to say the checklist is for the more qualitative items. So again, here's a screenshot of the sections page. You have at the top, it'll show you what district you're looking at. So this is Bangor Public Schools. This is their FY22 ESEA consolidated application, and this is revision 0. And you can see there we have all those sections down there. We have the validation messages, the ability to print various sections or pages, and then there at the top it shows we're in a status of draft started, and the next step in the workflow would be draft completed. And I just blew my great material for slide number 7. So it shows us the current status that we're in there, and then it displays the next status. Now, if you were to go back and look at a previous revision, like this is revision 0, and if we're on revision 3 now, if you went back to revision 0, there wouldn't be a change status on it because revision 0 is no longer the active revision. So you may not always see that change status to item because the change status would be on revision 3, not revision 0. The links for status changes are active, are always active. So if a user lacks the permission, when they try to change the status, it'll tell them that they don't have the permission. This is something we added pretty recently. If you hover on the status change, it will tell you what role is necessary to make that status change, and it will also tell you who has the ability to make the status change. So in this case, it's telling me, oh, I can't do this. I would need to be the LEA, ESEA Consolidated Application Director. So you could either talk to your user access administrator to be given that role, or you can see, oh, Jill can do this. Let me contact Jill and ask her to submit. So this is something I think is pretty helpful that was added pretty recently. And these are on invoices and other things as well. So just to give you hints of like, yeah, you can't do this, but here's who can, and here's what you need to be able to do it. And then we point this out. As I said earlier, the funding application is in a status of not started initially. Like that's how a funding application comes to exist, is in that status of not started. Districts are going to need to move the application into draft started before they can start filling it out. If they go into the pages or they go into the budgets or the program details pages, they're not going to be able to fill it out. It's not going to be editable until they move it to draft started. So that's a question you might get a lot of early on. So we put it in yellow because it comes up a lot. So then a section is just a grouping of related pages in a funding application. Some sections only have 1 page. Some section might have 10 or 15 pages. Each grant, or in the case of the ESEA consolidated projects, they have their own section. It might be specific to a grant, or it might just be general. If there's a grant in a funding app that is not allocated for that district, so in the case of the ESEA consolidated, for example, there's 13 grants in there. And if a district only gets 3 of them, they're not going to see sections for the 10 grants that they don't get. So we try to kind of pare it down as much as we can, just to make it kind of, not cluttered for the user. And you can expand or collapse individual sections or all sections. There's links there at the top of the sections page. You can say view sections only or view all pages to expand everything or collapse everything. And you can do the same thing with individual sections. The allocations page, it displays the allocation for each grant in a funding app. So in this case, this is a look at the ESEA consolidated with many grants. So it gets kind of wide. Now, if we went to this for the CT secondary, it would only have really like 2 columns, one for the allocation type stuff and then one for the grant. And for ESEA consolidated, this is where the district would transfer funds across grants. So as you can see down there on the bottom half of the page, they can move grants from Title II, Title III, and Title IV into some of the other grants. And if they wanted to do that, they would do that at the bottom, on the bottom half of this page. So funding apps that don't have this concept of transferability, this portion of the page isn't going to show up for them. Funding application page navigation. So this is, there's a save and go to. Sometimes it'll say save and go to, sometimes it'll say go to. It just depends on whether the user has the ability to save on the page that they're on based on their roles in the system and the status of the application. So in this case, it says save and go to. And it basically allows you to either kind of step through the application or jump from any page to any other page. So a couple things happen when you use the save and go to. It refreshes your session timeout, as we talked about. So it's going to automatically save the page that you're leaving. It's going to reset your session back to 60 minutes. So wherever you're going to, you'll have that time. You have a couple options. You can save and go to the current page, which basically just saves the stuff you're working on, but keeps you on that page to continue working. If you're on a page that's narrative heavy and you're filling out a lot of narrative responses, maybe you want to save this page after every question you finish responding to, so that you keep that data and you refresh your 60 minutes. You can save and go to the next page, and that'll basically just walk you through the section. Save and go to basically mimics the sections page. It's got all the sections, and then for each section, it expands out to the pages in that section. So if you save and go to the next page, it'll just walk you through that section. Save and go previous, it just takes you back to the previous page. If you get to the last page or the first page in a section and you try to go next, or you try to go previous, and there's no next or previous page, it'll just take you back to the sections page. Page locking, we talked about the session timer and how when a user is on the page, and the page is editable, that user establishes a lock on that page. So then if another user comes to that page, they get a read-only view of the page. So they can see the page basically as of the last time it was saved, but they can't make edits to the page. So you might get a user like right here, it says page is being edited by Jill Jones. That basically just means that I'll show you the page, but you can't edit it right now because Jill has it. Now, if Jill left the page or Jill signed out of the system and you refresh this page, then you would not see that message because you would be the one that has the lock on the page. Another user might see a message that says, you know, Chris has a lock on the page. So that's like page locking by a user as the application is being filled out. And that's the second bullet. And so the other thing about page locking is basically when the funding application has been submitted, we lock it so that you're not reviewing an application that is changing. So when they submit it and move it in a draft completed, it gets locked down. They can't make changes to it. When you're reviewing it, it's still locked down. If you send it back to them to modify stuff, it reopens it so they can, you know, make changes to it and then resubmit, and then it locks it again. As we talked about, as you create revisions, once an application is approved, that instance of the application is locked down. They can't change it. They would have to do a revision, which would be the editable one, and then you would have the history of basically each approved version of the application. So I'm going to jump over here, and I'm going to sign in. And I'm going to search for Auburn. And so I can either just click Auburn, or what I can do is I have these shortcuts that I can go into their funding apps or their invoices. But when I click Auburn here, again, it gives me, so now I'm in the context of Auburn. It shows me this on this little subheader menu, and I can go look at Auburn's funding applications or invoices. So I'll go to funding applications, and we have a couple. So these are showing up because we've allocated them grants. So they have this CT secondary application, which is in a status of not draft started. I filled some of this in prior to the training, just so we didn't have to take you through every aspect of filling out an application. And then they have the ESEA consolidated and special ed applications that are in a status of not started. And then they also have this McKinney-Vento. They're not allocated, but they don't have to be because it's a competitive grant. So if they wanted to apply for this, they could go in to that, move it to draft started, and start filling it out. So I'm going to go into Auburn's consolidated application. And as we said, it's in a status of not started. I can move it to draft started if I want to work on it. And then we have, here's all the sections in the application. And so if I view sections only, it collapses it down. Or I can expand individual sections. So like Title I has a few. And so as we talked about, you only see a grant section for the grants that are allocated. So in this case, I've only allocated 2 grants for Auburn. And if I go into this allocations page, I can see I have allocation for Title I and I have allocation for Title IIA. This is the page where I would do transfers, but I can't do transfers because I didn't move it to draft started, which is my yellow note, and I violated it myself. So I'll go back to the sections page and I will say, let's move this to draft started. I will do that. And so now my application is in the status of draft started. I can move it to draft completed when I'm done filling it in. But I will show you the allocations page. And if I wanted to move money around, so for example, I could move $20,000 from Title II to Title I. You'll notice when I do this, so now my $50,000 of Title II, when I entered that positive $20,000 here, it automatically put in a negative 20 there. So my Title II allocation is now $30,000, and my Title I allocation is now 120, which is the 100 that I natively had plus the 20 that I moved in from 2A. So again, this is unique to the ESEA, this transferability. And you know, if districts don't want to transfer, they can leave that blank. But if the districts that do want to transfer funds across grants, it's this bottom portion of the page where they would do that. And then I have the save and go to. So again, as we said, the save and go to sort of mimics the sections page. So I have my history log, the pages that are in it. I have this consultant checklist and my ESEA application section. So as users kind of, I think, get comfortable with the system and the navigation of it, you know, they might jump directly from, hey, I'm on the allocations now, I want to go to the 2A related documents or whatever that is. But at first, you know, I would say maybe districts will probably do save and go to sections, kind of get their bearings, figure out where they want to go, or save and go to the next page and just be walked through it. So again, this will save for me. So I'm going to save and go back to sections. So this allocation transfer that I did here will be saved in the system, and then my session timeout just went back to an hour. So I'm going to jump back to the slides. So we're going to talk a little bit about some consolidated specific stuff now, projects. And the way you do this is from the sections page. There's a link to create school and district projects within that allocation section. You can create or delete projects on this page, as well as allocate the money from your grants to the various projects. And so what will happen is when you create a project, that will create a new grant section, but it won't show up in your save and go to until you go back to the sections page. So this is another yellow highlighter one of that project you create on this screen will get into the save and go to, but it won't do that until you go to the sections page, because this is sort of like you're creating a section on the fly and the system has to kind of reset itself to understand that it's there. So as you create these projects here, they will eventually appear in save and go to, but if you create it here and then you go up here to save and go, it's not going to be there yet because it doesn't know about it. So you have to go back to the sections page for the save and go to kind of refresh and understand that that project is there. So the project budgets, once you've created a project, the project budget will populate with the grants that fund that project based on the money you allocated it to it in the create school and district projects page. And so for each of those projects, you budget by object and function for each of the grants that contribute to the project. So in this case, they put $85,000 of Title I money into it and $15,000 of Title IIA money into it for this Title IA school choice project. And then, so a slight nuance on this is a school-wide project. If a district creates a school-wide project, They put Title I money into it. That Title I money is automatically considered school-wide, so they basically have to budget in the school-wide object and function. The rest of the budget will be grayed out. Now, the other grants that contribute to a school-wide project, they can opt to indicate whether that grant is a school-wide participant or not. And checking that box will basically toggle the editability. So in this case, they're not a school-wide project, so this school-wide cell is not editable, but the rest of the budget is. They check that and make it a school-wide project, then this one grays out and these open up. Excuse me, I said it backwards. If they make it a school-wide project, these gray out and this one opens up. So Title I grants in a school-wide project are inherently school-wide, and there's nothing you can do about it. But the other grants contributing to school-wide project, the district indicates whether that grant is contributing school-wide or not, and then that affects whether they budget the money in the school-wide cell or in the regular budget cells. For basically for the other grants, the non-consolidated grant applications, they have a budget page that displays the total for each, object or function, and then they can click into that to budget by that object or function, and then they create a series of budget entries that indicate, I'm spending money on this object and this function. Here's the quantity and the cost, and the system calculates the total. I put a narrative of what this budget entry is for. Some of the grants will include budget tags. Actually, I'm going to move forward here. Some of the grants will have budget tags. Some of the career tech grants have this. So in addition to the object and function, these budget tags are sort of a third dimension of data collection. So in the career tech secondary grant, for example, they have the district indicate the activity that the budget entry is supporting, and they tie it to an approved instructional programs for that district. Location by default is going to be the district. They could change that to the school if they wanted to. The quantity will default to 1. They can increase the quantity. Whatever cost they put is going to be multiplied by the quantity for the total for that particular cell of $20,000. And these object and functions, they will, depending on which object or function you choose, the other object or functions will update. So if I choose function 1000, it's only going to show me objects that are eligible for that 1000 function. So it can vary. Some objects and functions have kind of more options than others, but the system is able to say, okay, for 1000 salaries, you can only have these 3 functions, for example, but for travel, you could have these 7. Some of the funding applications will have these budget overview pages that basically give you a 2-dimensional view of the budget. So in this case, we have the objects across the top and the functions down the side. So there's $20,000 in this cell. That's the 20 we just created, but they could have created 10 budget entries for $100,000. And this is just a rolled up view of that. And I'll give you a little tip here. Where you see a 0, that indicates that it is a cell that they are allowed to budget in and they just haven't. If there's a cell that is disabled, which means like if you couldn't take travel on instruction, this cell would be blank. I'm going too far ahead. This cell would be blank if you couldn't budget there. It would be a 0 if you can budget there and you haven't. Special ed has a different view of this. It's one-dimensional. We put the 2 grants at the top and then the objects or functions down the side. But this is a read-only page that just summarizes any number of budget entries that they may have created on the budget page itself. So in addition to the budgeting, we have this concept that we generically refer to as program detail pages. So these are just pages where you collect additional information about an LEA's application beyond what is captured in the budget. So it could be information about a particular grant, or it could be more general things like assurances that apply to all of the grants in the funding application. So some applications are going to have multiple program detail pages. Some are going to have more than others. We're going to look at this career tech application. It's got quite a few. Typically, the data in program details pages enter directly into the system by LEA users as they complete their application. If you see an asterisk next to an item, it means that it requires a response and the district won't be able to submit. They'll get a validation error saying you have things you have to respond to before you can submit. Common data types that you'll see on program details pages, they may enter numbers, short text responses, they have narratives. They can be rich or plain text. They may select from a drop-down list or have radio buttons that they choose from. Checkboxes. There are some checkboxes that will enable or disable a subsequent set of questions. So like it would be like a not applicable would then disable all the questions that live under that not applicable. Or it could be a yes, this applies to me, therefore I have these 4 other questions that I need to answer. Date picker, grids, allowing multiple responses. Sometimes, it could be like, list your parent liaison, and maybe there's 1 or maybe there's 3. So they could fill in a name, and if they had 3 of them, they could add a row and fill in more names until they've entered all the ones that they need to enter. They can also, sometimes they're asked to upload documents. And then there are some, as I said, typically the content on program details pages is entered directly by the district, but sometimes it might be a read-only field that's calculating automatically based on entries in other fields, or it might be a read-only field with LEA-specific values that have been populated by MDOE. So an example of that would be like the FOPL negotiated rates for CTE. Perhaps the MDOE is uploading the data that's specific to the LEAs on a page like that. So there's a variation, rich text and plain text. Plain text, you can just sort of like copy and paste the text. It's not formatted. It would be like if you were using Notepad on your computer. And then there's rich text, which allows some formatting. You can paste certain content from Word. Rich text in some cases is nice, but if you want to report on data, rich text can be a bit of a problem because it doesn't really pull out in a kind of like tabular manner that you can kind of like easily create a list of here's everything every district submitted for this. So, sometimes plain text actually works better even if it doesn't look as nice. Related documents, MDE can specify that grants or sections that LEAs need to attach additional documentation. They can provide a template if they want everybody to kind of follow a standard format, and a document can be set to be required or optional. So if it's a required document, the district will have to upload something before they can submit. If it's an optional document, it'll just warn them and say, hey, you didn't upload this. Are you sure you don't want to upload something here? And then that document they upload is attached and kind of lives forevermore with this funding application. So that will always be attached to this, and you can go back and review those documents. So to add a related document, you just click the upload link on the related documents page, upload new. Sometimes you can enter a URL. Documents can be set up to indicate whether they want to allow a link. Maybe the district has something on their website that satisfies it. The thing with links is that a lot of times a link might expire, or a link might require you to be signed in or have certain roles in the system you're linking to. And I don't know that users always necessarily know that the links work that way. And so they may paste a link that doesn't work. So we generally set these up by default to not allow links because I think a lot of times the links they paste they don't just work generically from somebody else clicking it 2 weeks later. So by default, we don't allow the URL, but you could. So when you select to upload a data file, it just brings up your file system, and you can upload the document that you want to upload. You can give it a name if you want it to be called something other than what the upload document is called, a related document upload example. If I wanted it to be called something else, I could put that there. Then I create that, and that would show up then on this previous screen. It would show a link to that document that I had uploaded. So I'm going to jump out and demonstrate now. Okay, so we left off on the sections page, and this is the ESEA application. We talked about district projects and school projects. So we're going to do a little bit more in the ESEA application, and we're going to jump into another grant application for the other kind of budgeting process. So if you recall, we moved allocation from, we moved a little bit of allocation from 2A to 1. So I have $30,000 in 2A and $120,000 in Title I. It's saved because I used the save and go to. But so for the ESEA projects, there's this link to create school and district projects. And I'm going to create a few projects. Now, this is going to populate across the top with the grants that I'm allocated. So I have Title I, I have $120,000, and I have $30,000 in Title IIA. So I want to add a project. So there are predefined projects, neglected, delinquent, homeless, foster care. Basically, all of these above district are predefined project types. So I can say I want to have a teacher quality project. This by definition is a district level project, so there's not an option there. I'll add a couple more projects. And so we talked about how these are predefined, but I can also just have a sort of a project of my choosing. This is just a generic district project. Call it Chris runs a project, and it's going to be at the district level. And then I can also create a school or school-wide project. So if I create a school-wide project, I then select, okay, what school is this school-wide project at? And so what this list gives us is it gives us school-wide schools, but it also gives us non-school-wide schools, because non-school-wide schools can become school-wide schools. So we let them create a school-wide project for a non-school-wide school. Now we give them a warning in the validation if they do that, but we allow it to happen. So I'll create a school-wide project for Edward Little High School. And so then I have my 3 projects I've created here, and so I need to allocate my $150,000 of grant funds to them. So I'm going to give $80,000 to the teacher quality project, and I want to give, I don't trust myself with a lot of money, so I'm going to give that one $5,000, and I'll give this guy $20,000 and $8,000 and $2,000. So your goal then is you want to get this to 0. You want to allocate all of your grant funds across your projects. So I have all my Title I money allocated, my 2A money is allocated, so I'm good here. Now again, I created these projects, but they're not in my save and go to because I haven't like reset myself back at the sections. So now if I go to sections, these projects I created show up. I have a 2A teacher quality project, my Chris runs a project, and the school-wide project for Edward Little High School. So I'm going to go to the project budget for 2A here. And as we said, the grants that are contributing show up in their amount. So I have $80,000 of Title I money to put here. And so maybe I put $50,000 in salaries and benefits, and I'm going to put $20,000 in travel. I'm not good at knowing if amounts are right. I don't know if $20,000 of travel is like a crazy thing or it would never get approved. So don't kind of like take this for like, hey, this is good information. This is just how you budget. And I'm going to put $10,000 in capital equipment. So all right. So I've budgeted my $80,000 of Title I money, and then let's say I'm just going to use my Title II money on salaries and benefits. So I'll put the full amount there, and it will update for me. So now I've budgeted all my money for that. So a couple things then. These projects are now my save and go to because I went back to the sections page. So now I can go to those. Now if I go to the school-wide project, I'll just show you kind of the toggle that we talked about. So because Title I is automatically school-wide, so I can't uncheck that, right? So the only place I can budget my Title I money is down here in this school-wide cell for the school-wide function. So I'll just put the full $35,000 there. Now what we said though was that the other grants can opt to do it. So right now we're saying Title II is not a school-wide participant, which means all these cells are open and editable, but the school-wide cell is not. Can't type in there, but if I check this, it will toggle it, and now I put the money there versus up here. So it's up to the district on the other grants whether they want it to be school-wide or not, but when they check that box, it will swap it back and forth. So I'll just put $8,000 there. So that's the ESEA project setup and budgeting is there. I'm going to save and go to the sections page. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to jump from Auburn's consolidated application. I want to then jump into their CTE secondary application. So over here on the left nav, I'm going to hover and go out to funding applications. So we were just in here in the ESEA consolidated. doing the project stuff, but now I want to jump into the secondary application. And so we'll look at secondary, but this is pretty similar to the other, funding applications, this process. So I filled out most of the secondary application just so in the interest of time savings. So CTE has this needs assessment that has quite a few pages. So again, this is an example. And so I already moved them to draft started, but this is a section that is not grant specific. It's just about something needs assessment. It's a Chris Line needs assessment, I guess. So it's got, half a dozen pages, and then they've got specific pages for the various, 1S1, 2S1, 2S2 stuff that they would fill out. And then the secondary grant has any number of pages as well. I'm going to go to this budget page. I filled out some of the budget already, so they have an allocation of $100,000. I put in $75,000 worth of budget entries, but let's go budget some more money. So let me put some money in instructional staff training, for example. So I come in here and basically now this is showing me everything I have budgeted for instructional staff training, but I don't have anything, so it's blank. So I'm going to add a budget detail. It's going to default to this one that we went in under. I can put it under. So again, like these objects are available to instructional staff training. I'll put it in contracts. As I mentioned, some of the grants have tags tied to them. So the system can say you can upload tags, or this one requires you to tag every single budget entry. So we're going to put engineering technology, and then they also have to identify an activity. So let's call this professional development. And so this is Auburn Public Schools. I'm going to do a quantity of 2 and a cost of $10,000. And then I have to put a narrative of what this is. So I'm not good at this. So I'll say it's 2 $10,000 things. Hopefully the district will put better content in there than that. But this would satisfy for the purpose of me submitting this. So if I create that, it's going to, so now I'm back out here and I've got, this is the budgets that I have for the 2213. So we have this filtering thing at the top. And so that's right now it's filtering just to show me the 2213 function, but I could come up here and say show all. And this is everything that the district has in their budget. So you can see I have a lot of these types of things, unfortunately. But I have all these budget entries, and this filtering can be nice as you get a larger budget. Like you have a budget with dozens of entries in it, you can say, you know what, how much, let me see all their budget items that are for, actually, let me select all there. Let me see all the budget items that are for salaries, right? So then I can just say, show me salaries, and there might be 7 or 8 or 10 or 12. In this case, I only have the 1, but this filtering lets you kind of do some pretty nice things. Or we can say, show me all the budget entries that are for this. I was using this 15,000 a lot. Let me deselect all, so we can tie it to the tags. So I can say, show me the budget entries for this. And so actually, I think I hit that 15,000 for all, so it doesn't filter. But the filtering's nice. Just to kind of identify issues. Now the narrative is required. So if they didn't fill out the narrative and they got a validation error saying fill in the narrative, you can search for, say, missing narrative required, and then that would bring up just the ones that they need to put a narrative in to pass the validation. So the filtering's nice as you get larger budgets to kind of slice and dice the way, and the district can filter it, and you can filter it as well when you're reviewing it. So right now then we've budgeted 95,000 of our 100,000. I'm going to go to this budget overview page that we showed you as a roll up. So this is just a 2-dimensional budget grid for CTE. We put the objects across the top and the functions down the side. And so this will by default just show me objects and functions they budgeted in. If I just want to see, hey, what are my possible combinations and permutations, I can show and hide these unbudgeted categories. And this shows me this is basically the complete budget for CT secondary, the allowable objects and functions. We have a lot of zeros because we didn't use most of them. So if I hide that, then it just takes me back to the ones that I've used. Go back to the sections page. So we just did the budget page there. I'll take you through some of these program detail pages. I'll start at this Perkins application. So this is a program details page. There's actually nothing for them to respond to here, though. This is just application instructions. I think sometimes it's helpful to put these at the beginning of a section, just to kind of like walk a district through what to expect and what to do here. So I can just save and go to and walk through these, and we can see all the sections or all the pages they have. So here we have narratives. As required by your local needs assessment, please describe how your approved programs align with the in-demand industry sectors. This is the response I put in. We'll come back to that later. The district, this is when we talked about some data is loaded by the state and it's specific to the LEA. This is an example that we loaded, and I don't know this to be true for Auburn, but this is just some test data I set up of the approved instructional programs specific to Auburn. Here's a checkbox the district has to click to acknowledge that the list is complete and accurate, and if it's not, they're instructed to contact the CTE representative at MDOE. And you see there's an asterisk there, so they couldn't submit without checking that. So if I save and go to and just walk through some of these pages, administration plan, and again, these are whatever the grant needs. So we worked with the CTE team to figure out what data they wanted to collect. Again, I filled in most of these. I put responses just to pass the validation. Obviously, the district would come stronger than this, hopefully. But as we cycle through, here's an example of a drop-down list. They have these yes, nos that are required. This is an add a row. So this is saying what programs to study that they need to answer on. So this district might have 2 programs to study, or they might have 10. So, I would go through and add the rows for this, for the content that is relevant to my district and answer the questions for those items. So they have a plant sciences program of study that they're running at Central Maine Community College is what we're indicating here. A lot of narratives. Go through a few more of these. Here's a related document that they can upload. So the related documents is its own page, typically at the end of a section, but we can also create a reference to a related document on a details page. So for example, it allows us to put the document kind of in the context of the question. So this is questions about CT special populations. So rather than having to go to another page to upload it, which they can go to the related documents page at the end of the section. They can also just upload that document directly here. It's an optional document, so we're not going to upload it. So those are examples of some of the program details pages. Now, I will go to this related documents page. So this is a special, as I said, on a details page, we can put a reference to related docs. So the related documents for CT secondary, there's 3 of them. We only put the one on that page because there was a question there around it. So we could put a reference to that. They could upload it on that page or they could upload it here. It would be the same document either way. Think of the related documents page as sort of like an index of all the related documents in a section. And then some of them are linked to elsewhere in that section, but everything would be on this page. So because I'm hitting a local version of my site, some of the document stuff doesn't really work because the document stuff lives in the cloud and my local version doesn't really support all that. So the template, if I click the stakeholder template, it's going to basically launch this document for me. This is a blank document that every district could pull down if they wanted to fill out that document. So then I could click this upload link, and I filled it out as well. So I have here's a completed version of it. It was completed by Chris. Sally Smith is a CT secondary teacher at Auburn. So they could upload that document here by clicking this upload new, and it would take you to the file system and upload the document. And then that document is attached to this funding application. It doesn't like live separately. You don't have to go find it in an email the district sent you. It's now a part of the application historically. Okay, so we'll jump back to the slides. So validation. Validation is just checks that are put in place automatically in the system to try to ensure the quality of the data being submitted by the district. Validations run automatically as the application is completed by the district. So when a district starts working on their application, it probably isn't going to pass validation because it's an incomplete application. But as they fill out more, a lot of the messages will resolve themselves just by virtue of them completing the application. So you'll see validation messages on that sections page in the validations column. And the system will not prevent the district from saving invalid data. It will prevent them from submitting it. Because a lot of times invalid data just means it's incomplete, right? Like the district might work on their application for a few weeks, and until they put in all the pieces, it may not pass all the validations. So for example, the required narratives. If I haven't filled in a required narrative, I have a validation error. But it just means I haven't gotten to it yet. So the checkpoint from the system's perspective is when they go to hit draft completed, we're going to say, okay, do you have any errors? And if you do, we're going to prevent the submission of it. A lot of validations might span multiple pages. So it might be, if you budgeted money in this particular combination of object and function, then you have to answer this question or do this or that. So some of the validations are pretty standard, like, hey, you can't budget more than you're allocated and things like that. And hey, you didn't answer this required question. But then there's a lot of very custom things that we've done. For example, we allow a non-school-wide school to create a school-wide project, but we validate and give them a warning just to make sure that that's their intention. So that's something that kind of spans a few pages. There's two types of validation messages. There's errors, which we said will prevent the district from submitting their application, and there's warnings, which basically just point out an issue, but allow submission. And on that sections page, you could, at the top row of the sections page is all. And if you click messages on that row, it's going to give you every validation message in this funding application. But maybe you only care about, if this is a special ed application, you've got the 611 and 619 grants, maybe you only work on the 611 grant. Somebody else works on the 619 grant. So you could click messages on the 619 section and only see the validation messages for that particular grant section. Or you can only look on a particular page if this is a page you care about. So basically, the user can look at the validation messages that they are interested in resolving, whether it's everything in the application or just a section or just a particular page. The validation messages will show you, okay, so for example here, this is the school project for Fruit Street School. These are issues with the project budget. These are issues with the project details. It calls out what the issue is, and there's a clickable review link on each one of the messages. So clicking that link will take the user to the screen where the issue is, which is typically where they can resolve the issue. And then they're going to need to resolve all their validation errors before they are able to submit the application. As for warnings, that's something that probably when the application gets to the state, you may assess those. In a lot of cases, you would allow a warning through because it just doesn't apply to that district. But in others, you might want to call out to the district of, hey, in your case, I want you to resolve this issue. From the sections page, we can print. And basically, print generates a PDF copy of the application that you can then print or save or email or do whatever you like with. And again, print works the same way as validation in that you can print the entire application. You could print just a section. You could print just a page. Or if you kind of want multiple non-contiguous pages, you can check the select items box there at the top, which renders a checkbox next to every single page. And then you can select whatever kind of combination of pages it is that you want to print. And it will generate that PDF. You just want to make sure that your pop-up blocker is turned off because it will. kind of pop up a notice that the print's ready, and that can get blocked by your pop-up blocker. And so when you choose to print something, basically what will happen is it'll take you to this screen. It will fill in the document name and your email address. And what it's going to do is it's going to attempt to print now and just render the document for you. But sometimes these documents are rather involved and they take a little while to generate that PDF. So what will happen is it will attempt for like 30 seconds to generate the document for you right now. If it gets to 30 seconds and the document's not ready, it'll pop a screen that basically says, hey, your document's going to continue processing in the background. You'll get an email when it's available. I believe that email will contain a link to the document, but that document will also show up in just your MDOE resources. So when you go to MDOE resources, as we said, that's like content for everybody. But it's also, if you have a print request that ran long, when you're signed in, it will render your print request there at the top. And as we see, these expire. So after 5 days, that would just go away on its own, or you could delete it if you downloaded it and you no longer need it. So again, it's a PDF. So you can print the PDF, download the PDF, email it, and do whatever it is you want to do with the PDFs. So let's talk about the roles for editing, submitting, and reviewing. The funding application director at the LEA, they can move it to draft started, draft completed. Draft edits completed is basically if the state has sent it back to the LEA for modifications, they move it to that status and it bypasses the fiscal rep and authorized rep. The fiscal rep and authorized rep only have to sign off. Basically, once the authorized rep is signed off, it doesn't have to go back through the fiscal rep and authorized rep. So that's what that draft edits completed status does, is it basically fast tracks it directly back to the state. But basically all the milestone status changes of the district are controlled by the funding application director. The applications can be edited by users with the funding application update role. They just can't submit it. So then the fiscal rep and authorized rep at the district, they can edit the applications. The fiscal rep can move it to the LEA fiscal rep approved or return not approved status, and the LEA authorized rep can edit the application as well as approve it or send it back for modifications. So once an application is finished and it passes validation or there's no validation errors, the LEA funding application director should move it to draft completed. Specifically, once it's in draft completed, specifically for ESEA consolidated application, school and school-wide projects are going to need to be certified by the school principals. So the school principals would have received an email when the application went to draft completed to tell them to go in and certify their application. And for the non-consolidated, it would just be draft completed, and it would be then waiting on the fiscal rep and LEA authorized representative. So once it's draft completed, or in the case of ESEA consolidated, once the last principal certification occurs, the fiscal rep is going to get an email to review it. Once they've reviewed it and approved it, the authorized rep is going to get an email. Now, once both the fiscal rep and authorized rep have approved it, they don't need to review it again, as I mentioned. Basically, once it makes it to the state, they no longer have to sign off on changes. And then if the state returns it to the LEA for modifications, once the LEA has made the requested changes, they would move it to this draft edits completed, which sends it back to the state. And so this is just kind of a little more on the school projects. School and school-wide projects need to be certified by the school principal once the application is moved to draft completed. The school principal will receive an email on the projects awaiting their certification, and they would do that on the project budget page. The project budget page will give kind of hints of like, hey, who can do this? So in this case, Sally Smith at Bangor would be able to certify this particular project at Fruit Street School. As I mentioned, once all the school projects in the district are certified, the next reviewer in the process will receive an email to review the application, and the school projects will only need to be certified once. Once they've certified it, even if there's changes to it, they don't need to go back and certify it again. Submission and review. So when they go to move it, when they go to change a status to draft completed or approved or whatever it is, the system's going to check, first of all, hey, does this user have the permission to make this status change? So a user that just has the update permission isn't going to be able to move it to draft completed, because we said that that is a role, that's the director role at the LEA, not the update role. Does the time frame allow for this status change? We can kind of time box these things and say, you can't start working on your application until June 1st. So if they want to move to draft started on May 15th, it would say, you can't do this now, you got to wait till June 1st. Or we can set a deadline and say, you have to submit this by such and such date. And if you don't make that date, it's too late to do it. Is the application valid? So on forward moving steps, which is to say submissions or approvals, the system's going to run validation to make sure, hey, there's no validation errors. Now, certain status changes aren't going to run validation just because they're sending it back to reopen it. Some of the status changes require users to check a box agreeing to some sort of assurance, and then that is documented in the history log, who agreed to that and when it was. So this is sort of like if the fiscal rep or authorized rep has to sign off on a specific assurance, you could do it on that status change, and it would be documented in the history log that that's the person that did that. So when a status change occurs, there's going to be an entry added to the history log documenting that status change. The next person in the submission or review workflow is going to receive an email saying, to notify them that the application requires their attention. We talked about how when they move to draft completed, the system locks the application, so they can't edit it while it's being reviewed, or if they send it back for modifications, that would unlock a locked application. When an application achieves the final step in the approval process, it theoretically becomes publicly accessible. If a user wanted to come out to the system off the streets and see what their school district is doing with their funding, they could search for that and find it and look at it. We can turn that off if you would like it to be turned off. By default, though, applications, once they reach a final approved status, are publicly accessible. I have no idea if anybody ever goes and looks at approved applications. But typically the laws in the states are such that they have to make those available to members of the community. And there's certain steps like moving to revision started that creates a copy of the application that becomes kind of the editable version of it. And the previous version is kind of like an archived one that you can go back and historically look at. The history log, we talked about this. Every funding application has a history log. It displays all of the status changes and comments related to a funding app. So in this case, on April 19th, I probably ran an allocation file to move an application to draft started. Terry Smith worked on the application, moved it to draft completed. As part of that, they agreed to an assurance that basically that everything they're doing is on the up and up. It received approval by the fiscal rep and authorized rep. And then in this case, Travis gave it his approval. And somebody had asked when I showed this, what's the SC? So this is just indicating if it's a status change or a comment. We had a user that couldn't do a status change because it was a competitive grant and they missed the deadline. So they went in and created a comment that said it was like authorized rep approved to create the appearance that they had submitted, but they hadn't. And so we added this column to call out whether this item is a status change or a comment. So comments, these are ongoing notes and discussion between MDOE and the LEA related to a funding application. They can be made by anyone with access to the application, regardless of the status. So as we talked about, the application, when they submit it, gets locked down. So you couldn't go in and change the budget when the application is locked, but you could go in and enter a comment because a lot of times, like if you're reviewing an application for a district, you may not want to return it to them and say, hey, you need to redo this. You might just want a clarification. So you could enter a comment in the history log and just say, hey, can you give me a little more background about what you're doing here? They could come in and respond to that comment in the history log. And that may be enough for you to say, okay, that's fine. I'm going to approve this rather than having to send it back to them for them to kind of clarify a minor point. So those comments show up in the history log. If you're targeting a specific person with a comment, you can also select to email it to that person because otherwise they're not going to see the comment unless they happen to go to the history log. So this is, I would say this is preferable to just sending the user an email in Outlook, because then you have to go back 6 months from now and find that email and try to discover that back and forth conversation you had with the user. Whereas if you put it in the history log as a comment, it's going to live there with the application. You're going to have that kind of historical knowledge. And as you move on from the agency or you retire, other users that then have to work with that district are going to be able to see that as well. Whereas if you had just had an email chain with them, that information may well be gone forever. So these kinds of back and forth, we encourage you to do that in the history log, just so you kind of have that documented history with them. Comments are not visible to public users. We talked about when an application is approved, it becomes public. Comments do not become public, just the status changes. So we can create a comment. So here they're asking if they can use Title IIA funds to pay for a substitute when a teacher attends professional development. So you can just create the comment and have it be in the history log, but you can also check this box to say, I want to send this to people. So in this case, they've elected to send it to some users and put it in the history log. And then checklists. So we're starting to bleed into the like the MDOE or the ESEA session that we're going to get into shortly. But basically, the checklist is a way for MDOE to provide feedback to the LEA when returning an application for updates. You basically, each item in the checklist you mark as okay, needs attention, or not applicable. So when you send it back to the district, the training for them is they should come to the checklist and look at the items that are marked attention needed. And the idea is that your common items are laid out here, and you can just check the box of like, here's the problem, rather than having to type a narrative of fix this, 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 and this. So again, if you send it back to the district, they should go to the checklist to try and identify what needs to be fixed and fix that. Do we want to break, or do we want to do a demo and then break? So we'll kind of pick up we did the related documents, and now we're back in the funding application. I'm actually going to create a comment. I'm going to go a little bit out of order with the slides. So we have this history log that shows us everything that's happened in the application. It was not started, and then I moved it to draft started yesterday. But I want to create a comment. So I go to this create comment page, and I'll say, can I use grant funds to pay for substitute teachers? Whatever this is a question the district would ask the state. So I can post that comment. I could just type this and save and go to the history log, and it would be there. But I want somebody at the state to know that I posted this. So I'm going to check this box, and I can come down here, and I have a series of options I can choose. But I know that Donna is my contact for career tech. So I'm going to say, let's send it to Donna Tyner. Now when I come up here and I save and go back to the history log, there's the comment that I added, and Donna also received an email that I added that comment, so she would be able to see the comment, and she could come in, and again, ideally Donna would come in and respond through the history log, so that we have that historical knowledge that discussion took place. So I'm going back to the sections page. And so now I believe as the district, I've submitted my application. I budgeted most of my funds. I filled out all of the program details pages to my knowledge. So I'm going to say, let's move this to draft completed. It's going to tell me the status can't be changed. One or more validation errors exist. So I can click here. It just takes me to the messages page, or I can go back to the sections page and look at it. But basically the issues I have are, there's a few pages, there's some assurance pages where apparently I never responded to required questions. So this is a validation. Again, the system will let there be invalidated, but it won't let you submit invalidated. These are errors. So as I go back, if I click review, it's going to take me to that page. And okay, so it's forcing me to accept the assurances. So obviously I would read through those very diligently, check the box. I'm just going to save and go next because I know that the other issue is on the next page. These are a little more involved, these assurances they have. So I got to check the box saying I agree to the assurances. Now, if I go back to the sections page, I have cleared all of my errors. So I am going to move to draft completed. And this is the assurance that I have to sign off on as the LEA, abiding by the assurances and so forth. So I'll move to draft completed. So at that point, the fiscal rep for the district received an email saying, hey, the application's draft completed. So the fiscal rep then knows to come in, review the application. Maybe the fiscal rep only reviews the budget. I guess that's probably up to the district, but it's also probably up to whatever guidance you would put forth, because I believe the fiscal rep is new in this process for Maine. The fiscal rep hasn't historically been involved in the review, and you guys have decided to add them. So I think there's probably some training on your part of what elements of the application they should be looking at. But let's say they went in and reviewed the budget and they were good with everything. They would then move it to fiscal rep approved. Now, if they weren't good with it, they would move it to not approved. That would reopen it so that the modifications could be made. If this was the ESEA application, there were school projects, this is where the school principals would have gotten notified to come in and certify their projects before the fiscal rep could approve. So we're the fiscal rep, we're going to approve it. We have to sign off on the assurance as well. I'm now the authorized rep or superintendent of the district. And this is the Gina Smith that we created with all the roles. So she's getting to do all these, or she could do all these. But I'm going to move it to authorized rep approved. So yes, I agree with that. And so all these things that we've just done, these status changes we've done, these are now all in the history log. They're all attributed to me, Grants4ME administrator, but in reality, these would tie to the district user that completed them. So maybe if Gina Smith had done this one, it would show her name, but you would have this history of, who's been working on the application, who submitted it, who's approved it.